Welcome, everyone. I'm Roy Idelson, President of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence, Division 48 of the American Psychological Association. Today is our fifth webinar in this year's series on resisting oppression and pursuing justice. Before introducing our speaker, I'll just note that now 5 years after the public murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, it seems that every day we witness the profound role that law enforcement personnel in the United States play in the Trump administration's authoritarian assault on our human and civil rights, especially toward disadvantaged and marginalized communities. With this context in mind, I'm really pleased that our speaker today is Alec Karakatsanis, the founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps, and that his topic will be policing and propaganda, how police and the media manipulate the news. He will be joined in conversation by our society's president-elect, Serdar Değirmenci. As one of the country's leading experts in constitutional civil rights, Alec has pioneered cases to challenge the size, power, profit, and everyday brutality of the punishment bureaucracy across the United States. He has also worked with directly impacted communities across the U.S. to design innovative new legal, advocacy, and narrative strategies for challenging widespread illegal and harmful practices of prosecutors, police, probation officers, judges, and private companies who work with them to profit from the punishment bureaucracy. In his latest book, Copaganda, How the Police and the Media Manipulate Our News, published by the New Press this past April, Alec defines propaganda as a special kind of propaganda employed by police, prosecutors, and news media that stokes fear of police-recorded crime and distorts society's responses to it. Every day, mass media manipulates our perception of what keeps us safe and contributes to a culture fearful of poor people, strangers, immigrants, unhoused people, and people of color. The result is more and more state repression, more inequality, and huge profits for the massive public and private punishment bureaucracy. As we go forward, please post your questions in the Q&A box below as we go, and hopefully we'll get to them before the hour is over. I'll now turn things over to Alec and Serdar with much appreciation.
Thank you, Roy. We are very excited to have you, Alec, here joining us. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Our intention was actually to hold the webinar earlier, right after or right in the week of May 25th, but Alec was busy. He was traveling particularly for the book, and so that did not happen. So what I would like to do is to ask Alec a few questions that I think would generate sufficient discussion, and then we will have sufficient time, I hope, for questions and answers. So let's start. And what I would like to start with is, so going back some 20 years, that's when I started policing. And very few psychologists study policing. So particularly in Turkey, mainstream psychologists were very uninterested, to put it politely, in policing. So they kept asking me why I was interested in studying policing. And my response was that policing was a burning issue. So I would like to ask you how you got started with policing.
Well, thank you so much, Serdar and Roy and all of you for coming to this. I hope it's a useful and interesting discussion for you all. So I'm very grateful that you're having me here and that you're interested in my thoughts and views. And I want to preface everything I say by acknowledging that I'm a relatively biased person, like all of us, so my experience comes from representing the most vulnerable and marginalized and poorest people in our society when the state is attempting to put them in a cage and separate them from their families. And that's really my entire career. So I've never worked in the police or I've never been a prosecutor. And so my perspective is really distorted in its own way by my life and career experiences. And so, I don't know if you'll agree with everything I say, but just want you to understand that like it's coming from that perspective. And it may be biased in certain ways as a result. So how did I get interested in the police and how did I come to thinking about policing? And I'll just say I'm interested much more broadly in what I call the punishment bureaucracy. And so it's not just police, but it's the entire constellation of for-profit and public sector actors that make up what some people call the criminal justice system. It's not a term that I use. I think it's a term of propaganda designed to get you to think that, either the purpose or the effect of this system is justice. I call it the punishment bureaucracy because I think it's much easier way to understand what all of these people are doing together, which is really an assembly line mass incarceration um, process that is extraordinarily profitable for the people that work in it all along the way. So I'm interested in the punishment bureaucracy and the stories that it tells us in our society for why it constantly needs to be growing and for why it's doing what it's doing. And I started my career and became interested in all of this stuff when I was a public defender in Alabama. And I was representing people who were too poor to afford a lawyer in really serious cases in Alabama and started to see on an everyday basis, sitting in jail cells late at night, talking to my clients and their families, investigating those cases, going into court and confronting some really incredible attitudes and assumptions and mythologies that justified in the minds of the people involved sort of this ritual of punishment, um, despite overwhelming evidence that it actually doesn't make our society safer. I started thinking about it then. And then I became a public defender in Washington, D.C. And then in 2014, I got a grant from Harvard to quit my job and start a civil rights organization with the goal of taking some of the knowledge that we learned from those individual cases and trying to attack this mass incarceration system more broadly and attack it in court using civil rights laws and civil rights cases, but also, I think equally importantly, to attack some of those mythologies, some of the propaganda, some of the narratives that our society tells itself about what this punishment bureaucracy is doing and why. Um, and so I think the rest of my career has been really focused on understanding how can we deepen the public's understanding of the real reasons that this system looks the way that it looks, who benefits from it, who's harmed by it, um, and how is that different from what we're told about who benefits from it and who's harmed by it. And so that's really how I came into it. And the more I've been working over the last 10 years, we've freed hundreds of thousands of people from jail with our cases. We've returned tens of millions of dollars to some of the most vulnerable people in our society. We've struck down unconstitutional practices all over the country, and yet these mythologies persist. And in some respects, after the 2020 uprisings 5 years later, some of those reactionary stories are more powerful than ever in the public consciousness. And so I set out in this book to understand those mechanisms and with a little bit of humor, hopefully, and a lot of examples and to make a really accessible book to try to understand that propaganda.
Thank you, Alec. I'm glad you started with the biases, and it sounds like we share a lot of our biases. So that's good. So let me go back not 20 years, but 30 years. I'll take you back to Detroit when I was a graduate student at Wayne State. And in many of your webinars, you talk about a pattern. And let me mention the pattern I noticed when I was a graduate student. This was in early 90s, and most people were extremely afraid in Detroit. And they were extremely afraid in such a way that when you talked about, for instance, getting on the bus, they would ask you, what happened? What sort of the response they were expecting was something that had to do with some sort of crime happening. And we were, when I say we, many of us from different parts of the world, we were fascinated by the evening news because the evening news was very bloody. So then
I think we might have lost Serdar. Okay.
my
Are you back?
apologies. You hear me?
Yes.
My apologies. My connection here in this apartment in East Lansing apparently isn't very good. Anyway, so it looks like many people were watching the news, and your book has to do with this. So let's start with your book. How did you decide on writing this book?
I think that what you're describing is one of the key things that I was trying to get at when I decided to write the book, which is what I call the volume of news and also the selective curation of anecdote. So, um, if you look at the news media in the United States, um, it covers certain types of harm in high volume every single day, right? And that affects what we think is urgent in our society. It also selectively covers those in order to create sort of certain impressions about the world that are easy to manipulate. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. But before I do that, let me just say I should probably define Copaganda, which is the title of the book, and sort of give you my framework for understanding what the news media is doing when it talks about the punishment bureaucracy. I think it's doing three things primarily. The first thing it's doing is it's narrowing our conception of safety and threat. So this is what Serdar was talking about on the bus. It teaches us to be afraid of certain people in certain situations, but to ignore other massive threats to our safety and well-being. So, for example, the news media might have us really, really worried about shoplifting or armed carjacking or home invasion or something like that, right? It tends to focus on certain types of crime committed by poor people, by people of color, by immigrants, and by strangers, like Roy was saying at the beginning of the session. And it tends to have us ignoring the far more significant types of harms that we're exposed to on a daily basis. So the types of harms that are perpetrated by people who have wealth and power in our society. So the news media might focus a lot on shoplifting, right? But wage theft by corporations is about $50 billion a year. That's like 5 times all property crime combined. Tax evasion is like $1 trillion a year. Okay. That's like 60 times all the property crime combined. But we don't have nightly news stories on the news every single night about wage theft or tax evasion. So our conception of what to be afraid of changes, right? So air pollution, there's millions of air pollution crimes every single year, just spewing out toxic stuff into the air. Air pollution kills 100,000 people in the US. That's 5 times all homicide combined. It's not treated as a daily news story, and so we don't necessarily feel urgently about it. Same with water pollution, hundreds of thousands of those violations. You get the point. I talk about a couple of years ago when I went and looked at the data in the US, um, the federal government prosecuted 23 people for environmental crimes in a whole year. Okay. That same year, they prosecuted 23,000 people for nonviolent drug offenses. These same patterns are through a variety of mechanisms I talk about in the book in terms of the policing and prosecutorial public relations industry, which is the bustling underworld beneath all the news stories you read, those patterns are also perpetuated in the news. We don't hear about all these other threats as much as we hear about the threats posed by poor people and migrants, etc. The second thing that it does is, having narrowed our conception of safety and threat, it constantly makes us more and more and more afraid of that narrow range of threat. So if you look at the public polling over the last 25 years, every single year, the public thinks that crime is going up. Almost every single one of those years, crime has been going down. So much so that we now have historic 50, 60-year lows since we began really keeping these records. Okay. But one interesting thing is, if you look beneath those polls, when people are asked about their own neighborhood, they're much more likely to be accurate. So they're much more likely to say, oh, crime in my neighborhood is not going up, but it's going up everywhere else. So when their perception is mediated by their own experience in the world, it's more likely to be accurate. But when it's mediated through the mass media, it's more likely to be inaccurate. And then the third thing that it does is, having narrowed our conception of threat and made us more and more afraid, Copaganda tells us that the solution to all of our fears is always more and more and more and more investment in the punishment bureaucracy. And this is kind of like modern flat earther syndrome or climate science denial, right? Because we know from the actual empirical evidence all over the world and in our own history that levels of violence and harm in a society are not connected to things like, are there 12 officers on patrol or 9, or is this prosecutor charging 48% of cases or 32% of cases, or is the sentence for this crime 14 years or 9 years, right? Harm and violence in a society are determined by levels of inequality and violence, levels of toxic masculinity, access to healthcare, right? So one of the biggest, in all the studies, one of the biggest factors is access to Medicaid, early childhood education, the extent to which people are alone and isolated, so loneliness and isolation versus human connection. So things like, are there places for people to go and congregate? Are there theater and music and art and other things for young people to do, right? Lead poisoning, right? These are all things that are hugely correlated with levels of harm and violence in a society. They have nothing to do with the punishment bureaucracy. And yet, every single day on the news, we're told that it's the little tweaks in policies to policing and prosecutors that are determining our levels of safety. And so, how does this actually happening in the news? Well, I mentioned shoplifting and retail theft, and I mentioned this concept called the volume of news. So I want to return to that for just a second. If you guys remember, a few years ago, there was a viral news story out of San Francisco with a video of a really incredible shoplifting. A guy was on a bicycle and he was stuffing stuff into these bags, and he somehow like balanced and rode out of the store on a bicycle. Tens of millions of views. That one shoplifting led to 309 news stories in the next 28 days around the country. Okay. At the same time, there were no major news stories at all about the far larger wage theft allegations against Walgreens from its own employees. Okay. So what does that do to a society, right? And I think that's where I get to this concept of the selective curation of anecdote. So imagine if you asked me to talk to a high school student who wants to play basketball for the basketball team, to tell them a little about the history of basketball. Well, I could make them a video of Michael Jordan, and I could make a montage of every missed shot in Michael Jordan's career. It'd be like 9 hours long, just miss after miss after miss after miss after miss. I'd show it to this young kid who's never seen the NBA or the old NBA before. This kid might think that Michael Jordan's a bad basketball player. Might even wonder, like, why is this person in the NBA just missing shots all the time? What I've done is I've used true anecdote to create the false impression that Michael Jordan is a bad basketball player. And that's what the news media is doing on a wider level to our brain chemistry with something like retail theft. They created this panic about retail theft a couple of years ago at a time when retail theft was not up. We now know that because of the industry's own admissions and some good investigative journalism. And they created this sense that retail theft was increasing. This is also what the news media does with crime generally, right? And with harm. It's distorting our conception of what we're afraid of and how much it's increasing or decreasing through the selective curation of anecdote. And the best propaganda is when you're able to use true anecdotes to create that false impression. It's actually a lot less effective, according to scholars of propaganda, if the anecdotes you're using are easily falsifiable. But if you're using true anecdotes, it's actually easier to manipulate people, particularly liberal intellectual elites. So I talk about in the book how liberal intellectual elites are the most susceptible of anybody to this kinds of propaganda. Did we lose you, Serdar?
No, I'm here. I'm listening.
Um,
Uh,
I
can you tell us a little about who exactly produces the propaganda?
Absolutely. So there's a lot to say about who produces the propaganda. I'll just start by saying one of the most important components of this story is sources. So every time you see a story in the news, you can be asking yourself a bunch of questions. So why is this story news? Who brought this story to the reporter? Who benefits from this story being told versus some other story being told? So out of the 10 million things that happened last night in the world, how is the newspaper, the TV news channel deciding which, 7 to 9 things they're going to tell me about, right? And which things they're going to ignore. And then of those things that do get reported, what is the language that's being used? Who is quoted? Who is framed as an expert? Who's benefiting from all of these choices, right? And one thing that I researched for the book that really blew my mind is the extent of the policing public relations industry. So the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, which has been in the news a lot recently with the crackdown on protests in LA, itself has 42 full-time public relations officials. Um, that's incredible for one sheriff's department. The LAPD um, has 25 more. So just the top two police departments in Los Angeles. I'm not even counting the dozens of other police departments, the prosecutors' offices, the police unions have their own separate PRs, City Hall, right? The probation and parole officers have their own ones, the prison guards have their own, but just those two police departments have 67 full-time PR people. In Chicago, when police killed Laquan McDonald 10 years ago or more, they had 4 full-time PR people. Now they have over 50. There's almost 90 in New York City at the NYPD. So I could go on and on, but there's this world, as I mentioned, that's underneath all the news stories you're seeing. And this was fascinating to me because I received a note from a news anchor a few years ago. And he said to me, I've been following your work and I've been reading your stuff on propaganda, and I've been discussing it with our producers and the other anchors, and we agree with you. We don't want to be doing this. We don't want to be contributing to this. But you have to understand the problem that we face, right? We're a small local news station. We have to fill 24 minutes of coverage at 6:30 and 7 and 10:30 and 11, and then again at 7 a.m. Um, and the police make it so easy for us. They basically produce the news for us. They don't just send us paragraph descriptions of all of the arrests, but they also send us video, audio, charts and graphs. They send us photos. They send us people we can interview, experts we can quote, right? And so they basically use this massive budget in this time of dwindling local news budgets to produce the news for us. And so that was really fascinating to me. So I started working with that news station, and we created another organization called the Center for Just Journalism. One of the things that it does is it kind of works to engineer that process on the other side. So we connect local news stations to different types of sources, different pipelines of information. So instead of you know, going to the police department and just getting a list of all the arrests the night before, what if local teachers and nurses and public defenders and the people that do wage theft cases, what if they had relationships with those reporters and pipelines to get those news stories in? And what if instead of sending a reporter to the police station, the local news station just put a reporter in housing court. And instead of the mugshot of a poor person or a person of color on the local news, what if, the segment was like bad landlord of the day, and you got to learn about like what the local landlords were doing in tenant court. Turns out people love those stories, right? Um, and so it's a reframing of what it means to cover public safety, and you can organize people in. Now they're not going to get paid to do it like the police, but actually local teachers have a lot of stories to tell the local news. The people who inspect the soil in local playgrounds for lead, the people that do workplace safety inspections, these are people that are finding out vital information of public safety every single day, but they don't have PR departments. So what we've been doing is helping organize those people and also helping journalists understand that there's many different places they can look for news. And it actually can really change the way the news covers stuff. Right now, there are some I talk about in the book. There's lots of elite news outlets that are very ideologically supportive of the punishment bureaucracy. That's a whole other set of problems. There's also problems with the ownership of media and the political economy of the news, but also there's just a lot of people in the media and news industry who aren't necessarily ideologically opposed to a more just and equal society, and who aren't necessarily like ideological supporters of the police or prisons, etc. But through a variety of sort of everyday mechanisms come to produce stuff that supports those systems because they just don't have other relationships and connections. So one thing that we've been doing is trying to help cultivate and organize, whether it's child psychologists or teachers unions or healthcare workers in general, or civil rights lawyers, just organize different kinds of people to build relationships with local and regional and national news outlets to get different kinds of stories in the news. We're talking about public safety.
Serdar's having connection problems, so I'm going to ask some questions on his behalf. The one thing we've seen as peace psychologists is the use by major media, TV, I'm thinking of experts. Good example, retired generals, to explain war to us, American foreign policy, and so on. And what's pretty much never revealed is that these retired generals are now on the board of one or more defense contractors, and obviously are not objective in their analysis as a result. Wondering if much the same is true in certain ways of the experts that the media uses.
It's actually one of my favorite parts of the book. I have a couple of chapters about experts and also about how that expertise is then filtered into and weaponized by the mainstream news media. So there's a whole layer of problems here from, well, what constitutes expertise, right? And what is told to the audience about the person that they're hearing as an expert, right? Are they portrayed as some kind of person who just has a passion for knowledge and truth, and so they're on mainstream news, they're on CNN telling us that we need to bomb this country, or we need to hire more militarized police out of the goodness of their heart in the pursuit of human knowledge? Or are they a former police officer or the board member of a policing surveillance company or whatever, right? Like what is told to people is really important. Also, what's interesting is that a lot of news outlets don't actually track the experts that their journalists are using. And so you can study and you can see patterns in these experts. It's oftentimes the same small group of people that are appearing as either unnamed or named experts in outlet after outlet after outlet. And this enables a very small group of people to have a huge impact on what's thought of as common knowledge or sort of acceptable public opinion in the discourse. And the military industrial complex and the policing and punishment bureaucracies are very, very similar in this way. And they are both at their core enterprises of violence and control and and they're operating obviously at somewhat different levels, although they are very, very connected in terms of the sort of exchange of technology and surveillance and counterinsurgency practices, right? So, you've got the entire wing of what's called community policing in the United States, which is just bringing in military counterinsurgency tactics from colonial interventions from the French and British militaries at first in Algeria and Vietnam and India, and then through the US and Afghanistan and Iraq. And now that is sort of the main counterinsurgency tactic used by US policing. We can get into that. I talk about that in the book. But um, the 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 sort of, I think, one of the most important and maybe surprising for many people aspects of my book is I try to explain to people how seemingly liberal professors, scholars, um, nonprofit organizations, Democratic Party politicians, etc., um, through a sort of faux veneer of often expertise, are used to launder policies and attitudes and assumptions and beliefs and opinions that would be abhorrent or seen as abhorrent if coming from the right wing. So my book is really laser focused not on Fox News or Newsmax or the far right, although that propaganda ecosystem is also very important, and there's very important things happening there. But I'm actually interested in how do experts get so many well-meaning people, smart people, people who want a society with more peace, more justice, less violence, more liberty, more human flourishing. How do they get those people to support policies that do the exact opposite, often under the guise of reform? And so I think one of my favorite sections of the book is the section where I talk about um, how post George Floyd uprising, after the killing of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and there was this massive movement to change our sort of society's relationship with the police. Um, a lot of experts were weaponized to channel that energy away from things that could have transformed the way that those systems work toward things that actually increase and strengthen those systems. So I think the most incredible example and probably the most successful example of propaganda in modern policing history is the police body camera. So for years, the police desperately wanted this incredible surveillance tool. And even more than police, the prosecutors really wanted it. They saw it as a path toward dramatically speeding up the assembly line of low-level cases because they knew it would be used against the poorest people in our society and the lowest level cases to get them to plead guilty really quickly, because the system would break if people actually demanded jury trials and whatnot. And then the multi-billion-dollar police surveillance industry, companies like Axon, which used to be called Taser, which is the main body camera maker, but then Microsoft and Amazon, they saw this as like a tens of billions of dollar opportunity. And sure enough, the market capitalization has skyrocketed because it was a way of dramatically increasing surveillance and all of the contracts that come with it for big data storage and artificial intelligence analytics and over and over and over and over again training and software updating and new software contracts and sales. And it was a way to connect artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and voice recognition to the largest database of data in human history, right? So, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cops with mobile surveillance cameras going all over the country, deciding when to turn it on and off, and what's recorded and what isn't, and cameras looking outward away from the police officer. They had this problem, though. For years, they were pitching this and they couldn't get the money for it. It was going to be billions and billions of dollars. But after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, the policing industry had a really brilliant idea. They thought, well, let's use a bunch of experts, professors, even they even got the ACLU. This one guy at the ACLU played a very, very big role in this. And they weaponized former prosecutors and former police, and they got Barack Obama to recommend hundreds of millions of dollars in investments in these body cameras. And then they got local and state governments hundreds of millions of dollars, and then millions of dollars, right? And it was pitched as a reform for accountability and transparency. So we went from a situation where the police were so desperate to get body cameras before Michael Brown was killed that they were using private philanthropy to fund them for police. They were getting Steven Spielberg and others to give them money for body cameras, to a point where they got liberal elected officials across the entire country to fund this, not as a surveillance thing, which is how it was pitched in internal police circles, or how it was pitched in, let's say, United Arab Emirates, or India or Israel or other sort of more authoritarian societies. Don't need to convince the population that the surveillance systems are tools of progressive reform. Um, and I studied 9 years of media coverage, and even the news outlets that accurately describe body cameras as having no effect on police violence, so they actually don't even do the thing that they're thought to do. Even those stories portrayed them as a good faith attempt at what they called accountability and transparency. And that entire thing was fed to the public through experts. And these are Democrats, liberal professors, um, nonprofit lawyers, etc. And they laundered this thing that is the greatest expansion of surveillance in modern US history as a tool of police reform. And the entire story cannot be understood without understanding the weaponization of expertise.
Wow. This is fascinating and demoralizing. Can you describe, to kind of combat that, a success story? You and your organization kind of, specifically an instance where your work on the ground was able to lead to justice.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the first case I ever did as a civil rights lawyer, I was in Montgomery, Alabama, in the courtroom one morning, and I saw I had just started. I just gotten the grant from Harvard, and I was just going around the country, meeting with people. And I was in Montgomery, and I saw 67 people in the courtroom that day, chained together, shackled. All of them were black. As I watched court that day, I saw that not a single one of them was charged with a crime. They were all there because they owed debt to the city from old tickets. And Montgomery, like so many other cities and towns at the time, had privatized the collection of that debt. So if you got a ticket and you couldn't afford it, like if you were rich, you just pay your ticket. But if you're poor and you can't afford it, they would set you up with this private company. And let's say your ticket was $100. The private company would put you on a payment plan that costs $40 a month just for the plan. So let's say you could only pay, you're on food stamps, or whatever, you're disabled. You could only pay $20 a month. Each month your overall debt would be going up because the company would take its cut first. So there was all these people throughout Montgomery who were just on this endless cycle of debt. And when you missed a payment, they would have you arrested. So I watched one by one as these people begged the judge, please don't jail me. I'm a homeless veteran, or I have 4 kids at home. My kids are disabled. Please don't do this to me. And one by one, they were just thrown in jail. And I went up into the jail and I started interviewing people. And the first woman I met had a 1-year-old in her lap, and her 4-year-old next to her on the couch, and the police raided her home on a Sunday night and took her away from her kids, put metal chains on her, and threw her into the jail. And she'd been there for weeks, and she didn't know where her babies were. And all it was she owed debt to this private company. And she became my first client as a civil rights lawyer. And it turned out that they told her, her court document said, pay us $2,807 or do 59 days in jail. And she explained that in Montgomery, you sat out your debt at $50 a day. But if you agreed to be a janitor, you'd get another $25 a day. You clean up the feces and the blood and the mucus and the mold on the jail floors and the walls. All the women were sleeping on top of each other. So they had created this system of debt peonage, or slave labor for people that owed old traffic tickets. And we, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was really new at this. I took a photo of the court documents. I wrote a lawsuit, and within a few weeks, we're standing there in court, and the federal judge is so appalled at what's going on. Because it's illegal in our society to jail someone just because they're poor. That he ordered all the top city officials to come in and explain what's going on here. And instead of doing that, they just released everybody from the jail. And this was a big moment for me in my career because it it demonstrated the power of narrative and propaganda. Because although this was marketed as a system about public safety, the people in charge of it were so unconcerned with public safety and so sure about their jail having nothing to do with public safety that they could just release everybody on a single day, right? It's also very powerful. Even my grandma said to me at the time, um, that this was a really subversive moment for her. She understood that the reasons the government was doing stuff was different from the reasons that it was telling us it was doing stuff. And so right after that happened, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And I went to Ferguson. I started interviewing people in the streets and families and jail cells and courtrooms. And it turned out that Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants per household. 2.2 arrest warrants for every adult. I mean, think about that kind of a police state. Almost every warrant was for unpaid debt. So Ferguson had also turned its municipal court system into a debt collection enterprise. And we started winning these cases all over the United States, shutting down these companies, returning money. We finally just settled the Ferguson case for some reparations in addition to stopping the practices, right? Um, and and as we were doing that, we realized the same underlying premise that no human being should be put in a jail cell because they can't pay a monetary payment is the premise of the American money bail system. There's hundreds of thousands of people in jail on any given night, and we've sued and won all over the United States, striking down local money bail operations. And all of those cases, are really powerful from a counter propaganda perspective because anybody paying attention to them can see that if the legal system is deciding who is separated from their children, who's being denied medical care, whose pets are dying because there's no one to take care of them, who's losing their jobs and their housing, who's confined to a jail cell based solely on their access to cash, how can I trust any of the other stories it's telling me? All these experts in the news, these police and prosecutors and judges, they are the same ones that are doing this stuff. So how can I trust the things they're telling me? It's very subversive, right? So I think obviously the problems we're facing are profound and in many respects getting worse. But there have been enormous victories and there's a lot to build on. There's a lot of people over the last 10, 15 years that have developed much more skepticism about the stories that we tell ourselves about what the purposes of these systems are. Another really great one for people to look up is I've just started working with my colleagues on something called the Right to Hug campaign, where we're representing children across the United States to establish a constitutional right to hug their parents because millions of children around the US are victims now of this new set of policies in jails around the United States where the prison and jail telecom industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry owned by private equity firms mostly, has a kickback scheme with sheriffs where they get the sheriff to eliminate in-person visits for families on the theory that if you eliminate in-person free visits, people have to spend more money on phone and video calls. So all these children and parents around the country are now prevented from seeing each other when they're in jails, because the idea is we can extract more money from these families. And so we're working on this incredible. There's a really great Lester Holt NBC Nightly News story about our children in Flint, Michigan that we're representing that you could search for on the internet. There's a New Yorker article about this issue. These are all really successful cases that are helping people, but they're also cases that chip away at the stories that our society is telling itself about what the real purposes of these systems are.
It's great to hear those accounts. It's really helpful. We have a few questions that have been submitted. I'm going to try and put two of them together. One is about the mythologies and propaganda that increased since the 2020 uprisings and how to best counter that in your view. And related to that is whether what you are trying to accomplish, the important work you're doing, is set back or made more challenging by the Trump administration.
Good questions. Let me just say, first of all, this is a great question about the mythologies. And that's essentially what the whole book is about. You know, it's about these mythologies post 2020. I'll put a link to the book in the chat. If people are interested in, I don't know if I have access to everyone, Roy, but maybe you can share the link um, to the attendees.
I will do that.
And also there's a discount code that I'll type in. People can get 30% off the book if they order it with that discount code. I just also want to say none of the royalties go to me. All of the royalties are donated to an amazing charity that works with unhoused people on Skid Row in Los Angeles to fight police repression. And also, I'm giving unlimited free copies of the book. I got the publisher to agree to unlimited free copies of a special paperback version of the book to anybody in prison in the US and to anyone who's a professor or a teacher who wants their students to have the book and teach the course. So teach the book in any of their courses. So we're getting thousands and thousands more books out for. So if you're a teacher, if you know professors, and you think they might be interested, um, you know, also on the New Press website, there's a way to donate to that fund to get free copies for other people. But anyway, the point is that I don't want money to be an obstacle for anyone engaging in these ideas. And so this mythology question that is in the chat from Tiffany is the thing that I've been trying to monitor. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One myth that I think is so central is the idea that the little tweaks that we make in the punishment bureaucracy have any effect on what they call crime, right? So story after story after story, New York Times editorial about the mayoral election, about what they're going to do on the police with different candidates, or the recall of the DA in San Francisco, or the midterm elections in Congress about defund the police. All of these articles and thousands more news stories or whatever, they all proceed from a fundamental lie, which is that the little tweaks that we make to the length of sentences or the policies of the prosecutors or the police, that they affect overall levels of harm and violence in a society. That's the biggest lie of them all. What we know from actual history across the world, like I said a little bit earlier, is that it's structural features of our society and our culture that determine how much people hurt each other. It's not the little differences between the Houston police force and the Dallas police force, right? This is like climate science, right? And denying that is like climate science denial. And so that's one mythology that I'm trying to counter in the book, is really showing people all the subtle ways that the news media juxtaposes crime and harm and violence with policies of punishment bureaucrats. Very important. And they do that, by the way, to distract us from the deeper conversations about the material conditions in which people are living. Because the mainstream news media does not want us talking about big changes to our society that might involve much more equality, for example. So a second mythology is really important, which is that the problems with police or prison guards have to do with shortages of them, or a lack of training, or not enough good technology. So I have these really funny, I think, and interesting examples in the book that show how, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, all the violence that we saw police committing against people in thousands of cities was very similar violence that the police were perpetrating. Not just the underlying murders of Black people and poor people, but the way that they attacked protesters in very similar ways at all up and down levels of the police bureaucracy, intentional violence by the police or intentional sexual assault by prison and jail guards, right? These problems are somehow always framed as like, well, we just need to invest more in them. And it's actually interesting, historically, the day after the Bloody Sunday on the bridge in Selma, Alabama, was when the federal government and Lyndon Johnson signed the greatest expansion of police funding in modern history. And people forget that Northern liberal elites framed the problem with Southern police forces as not enough investment in professionalization. And so actually there's this long unbroken history underlined by this myth that if we only invest more in these bureaucracies of repression, they will somehow be able to be better. It's exactly the opposite, right? And so that's another one that I sort of walk people through with a lot of examples in the book about how every single time there's something really bad happening in the punishment bureaucracy, we're fed these myths that it's trying to be better. It's trying to make itself less violent. It's operating in good faith. All it needs is a little bit more preparation, a little bit more training, a little bit better technology, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is designed to distract us from the real functions of that system throughout history, which is to preserve the way society looks and to increase the ability of the people who own things and who kind of have power in our society to control social movements and popular movements for greater equality and justice. And that's, I think, the greatest myth of it all, that the purpose of the punishment bureaucracy is to keep us safe and to do justice, right? It calls itself the criminal justice system, right? And the Department of Justice, right? And just like the Department of War changed its name to the Department of Defense when changing times made it no longer okay to do wars of imperial aggression, and we needed to frame our violence in the world as defensive, right? The punishment bureaucracy changed the way it markets its violence in service of distributions of wealth and power. And so I think, Tiffany, that's what comes to mind. And in terms of the, for me, the Trump administration, yeah, of course, it's changing all of our lives in many respects. But I have to say, I've been focused for many, many, many years on the incredibly authoritarian and um, and brutal and grotesque violence perpetrated among but against the most marginalized people in our society. These corners of our society that actually already were quite fascist and authoritarian and senseless and incoherent and brutal. And what I've been trying to do for much of my career is get liberals and liberal elites to understand the mythologies that get many people who think of themselves as liberal and progressive and elite to either ignore or support tacitly or even actively a lot of those systems. So my own project is less about directly influencing the far right and the right wing, although there's a lot of stuff we're working on that tries to reduce the size and power of these systems so that they will be less effective and powerful when weaponized by the right wing. But my work has often, throughout its history, been about trying to convince people who would think of themselves as part of the anti-fascist coalition um, to think a little bit differently. And I see myself very much as talking to those people and trying to organize all people who of goodwill who don't want to see a far right authoritarian dictatorship. Um, how are so many of the things that we've been allowing and tolerating and even supporting and cheering contributing to a world that normalizes that kind of repression and violence so that it can then be weaponized and used by the far right? I'll pause, Roy. I think there were some more questions.
Yeah, we have like 3 minutes left. So I want to give you a minute to summarize if you'd like. I'll note that, and we don't have time for a full answer, but a really interesting question that was asked that in regard to protests where some organizers explicitly work with the police to ensure a safe, nonviolent protest, and attendees, in some cases, are even discouraged from expressing dissent toward the police. It seems like a really interesting topic. If you can respond in a minute, great, but take the next minute in any way you'd like, and then I'll kind of finish up.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that we didn't get a chance to really delve into all the questions. I was kind of rambling at you guys for a while, so I hope it was useful. I hope that you will get the book. You can order it with that discount code that I sent to Roy, and also, you can also Roy and Serdar have my email. I can, if you want to order it for your classes or for schools, I can also get a much more discount. Or if you think that you're working with people who can't afford it, I can get you free copies of the book. Just trying to get these ideas out there. And there's so much more to talk about. I mean, I barely scratched the surface of the stuff that's in the book. I think it'll be really surprising, some of the stuff for you, even if you've thought about these things a lot. I learned a lot from writing it, and I don't think I can tackle this really hard question of collaboration and co-optation with the police, but my instinct is the same as the person who asked the question. I think it's very, very dangerous to ever collaborate with sort of the institutions of state violence. Their goals are extremely different from ours, and that kind of collaboration risks a level of infiltration and co-optation that is quite dangerous. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't take precautions and keep people safe. And there are ways to interact with the police in a way that minimizes the violence they can do. And I've been a part for many years of the National Lawyers Guild, trainings and demonstrations and observing. And there's a lot to be said about how to minimize police violence in these contexts and how to hold police accountable to the extent our system allows it. But I think it's quite dangerous to sort of affirmatively and proactively work with the police on terms of planning the demonstrations or other actions that you want to do.
Okay. It looks like our time has run out. I want to thank you again, Alec, for being with us, and tremendous. It's tremendous what you've offered us, and the book as well, and the way people can obtain the book. I will send in the announcement that will go to everyone who attended the information that you put in the chat, because they didn't receive that directly. But a tremendous presentation. I'm sure I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone did. And I'll just conclude by saying that we, Division 48, our society, plans to hold a webinar every month on topics related to resisting oppression and pursuing justice, like this one. And if you're a member of our society, you'll receive notice whenever these webinars are scheduled. If you're not a member, we'd love to have you join us. You don't have to be a member of the American Psychological Association in order to be a member of our society. You don't need to be a psychologist either, just someone interested in peace and justice. And you can join us online at peacepsychology.org. Again, my thanks to Alec, to Serdar for his efforts, and to all of you for attending. And take care, everyone.